The Persona series is loved for many reasons, one of these being the lively and diverse cast of characters in any given entry. There's someone to love and or is relatable for every player out there. Like, yes, this series is an urban fantasy, complete with some supernatural stuff, but ultimately, these stories are very grounded in reality. And most every Persona game explores the concept of found family in some way. You know, finding other people who do accept you and encourage you for you. Something that's not always easy to find in real life. Hey guys, it's Lady, and I'm finally back with some more DRAT-style videos, standing for Discuss, Rant, and Tangent. And today I want to talk about neurodiversity in Persona. And just so we're all starting on the same page, neurodiversity refers to the vast differences in brain function among the entire human population. These variations in thinking, learning, and behavior are natural and represent the diversity of all people. Now, as you may have seen discussed online in recent years, autism spectrum and ADHD are two of the most commonly discussed conditions under this neurodiversity umbrella, though there are plenty of other conditions that fit into this category as well. Really quick, just want to be clear that neurodiversity is a spectrum for a reason, so when I bring up certain tendencies, hallmarks, and traits of any given condition, that's not me saying all people in that category do or think that thing. No group of people is a monolith. But with all that said, in this video I'll be focusing specifically on the autistic and ADHD-coded characters that particularly stand out to me within the Persona series. Okay, actually just another heads up, when it comes to Persona 1 and 2, it's been 6 years since I've played the first game and 2 since I beat the Persona 2 duology. So in other words, I don't have the greatest memory of either of them, so I can't comment too much on neurodivergent hints in those games, aside from one character who I'll bring up later. Persona 3 through 5 I've studied far more extensively though, and there are a handful of characters I'm dying to talk about via a neurodivergent lens. So starting with Persona 3, Akihiko gives me major signs that he's somewhere on the autism spectrum. Well, to be clear, I'm referring mostly to how he's presented in the original PS2 era, including Persona 3 Portable's additional social link with the FemC. You see, Persona 3 Reload removed quite a bit of his headstrong tunnel vision tendencies that, at times, put him more at odds with the other characters. Something I examined in great detail in my P3 Reload compare/contrast video you can find up here or down in the description. But long story short, PS2 Akihiko had a much greater lack of interest in socializing with others. I made the case that his portrayal in Fez is a more callous personality compared to Reload's interpretation, especially given the dorm activities and link episodes in the latter, which strengthened Akihiko's bonds with the rest of C's and with his boxing teammates. Nevertheless, if you recall my analysis of him in both the Persona 3 Mythology and Arcana videos, everything Akihiko does in the lead up to Shinji's death is to make C's stronger. He doesn't really engage in anything that doesn't also have a relevant training purpose to it, even when they're on vacation in Yakushima. It's like C's and boxing are his hyperfixation/special interests. Just these two things and that's it. And when I get in the zone when it comes to video creation, I rely on proper support via FlexiSpot's Ergo X office chair. As y'all who've been around my channel long enough know, my back is very picky since my transverse myelitis incident/diagnosis and all my chronic pain issues. So comfortable lumbar support is huge for me. Now, I found that this can be hit or miss depending on the chair, but the lumbar support in the Ergo X is very nice. Firm enough with also enough give. Okay, just a heads up, early on in the first few days, it felt like it might be a bit too strong, but at least I can attest to it feeling great now that I've broken it in. There is a knob that allows you to adjust the firmness of this lumbar support at 3 different levels. The seat depth and height from the ground is all adjustable too, so you can tailor things exactly to your specific needs. I've also enjoyed the convenient up and down, front and back, and sideways adjustability of the armrest. Super nice being able to change it up depending on when I'm typing/editing or when I'm playing a game via a controller. I'm overall really impressed with the Ergo X office chair considering its price point, and I'd again like to thank FlexiSpot for sending one over to me to try. Get up to 50% off and help support the channel by using my link down in the description. There's a big spring sale going on right now until March 29th. But returning to Akihiko, that brings us to his relationship with Shinji. OG Akihiko is much more pushy when it comes to re-recruiting him to C's. It's not uncommon for people on the spectrum to have trouble putting themselves in the shoes of others, something called perspective taking. This is the ability to recognize others may have thoughts, knowledge, emotion, and/or intentions that differ from one's own. This difficulty for autists can be especially pronounced when the other person is being very subtle or not directly expressing their own perspective. And Akihiko and Shinji's relationship throughout Persona 3's developing narrative fits this description to a T. Aki has a really difficult time wanting to and/or respecting Shinji's desire to stay away from C's, a trait that's particularly emphasized in Persona 2 era Akihiko. Again, P3 Reload's brand new Link episodes extend and builds his relationships with other characters, so his portrayal doesn't come off as aloof or unconcerned with others' opinions. On a related note, his social link with the FemC in P3P draws attention to this tendency to think literally. His reaction to the fangirls at the beef bowl place is a classic, genuinely not understanding the unspoken implications of why they followed him there.
Do you think those girls wanted to have beef bowls too? No. I love the FemC. Not in the way you think. I love how, like, just oblivious Akihiko is. So, what's your type? You mean my favorite type of beef bowl?
Also, the later ranks, like 7 and onwards, point to him dealing with what seems to be alexithymia. Alexithymia is a difficulty in registering and/or articulating one's own emotions, and it's not uncommon for autistic people to process these sorts of strong emotions differently, and it certainly takes Aki a long time to understand and articulate his feelings towards the FemC. Oh, by the way, I just want to say I love how Shinji is a direct foil to Akihiko in the emotional intelligence department. Like, on the surface, they both appear to be the aloof type of person, but for different reasons and in different ways. Unlike Akihiko, Shinji is very perceptive and aware of everyone else's feelings around him. It's demonstrated very clearly in his social link with FemC, as well as his P3 Reload Link episodes. He just chooses to distance himself and not get involved with others anymore. But back to Akihiko. Ultimately, I appreciate his depiction as someone who is quite self-assured and confident. Someone who's not afraid to be himself and doesn't struggle as much with thoughts of not fitting in with everyone else around him. Plenty of autistic people feel like no one understands them, and I think it's great when stories do explore that kind of experience. I'm just saying that with these things in mind, it's a nice thing to also have autistic-coded characters like Akihiko who do still have a lot of confidence and self-assurance right from the get-go. Now moving on to Persona 4. Guys, you can't convince me Yosuke does not have ADHD. Probably hyperactive type. So for those of you who may not be familiar with ADHD terminology, there are two primary presentations, hyperactive or inattentive, though some people are diagnosed with combined type. Now, one of the most common symptoms of hyperactive ADHD is this fidgetiness and restlessness, captured quite well in Yosuke's idol animations. His heel is always tapping the ground, or he's just casually flipping his daggers into the air. Then there's the animations whenever he's bickering with Chie. They are always these big, exaggerated movements. Like, take Yosuke as he's first presented in Persona 4 proper. He's the only one riding his bike to school, while the rest of the students are just casually walking. Bringing me to another symptom of hyperactive ADHD, and that's this impulsivity and general impatience. Many people with this kind of ADHD want to get things done as quickly as possible, often manifesting as this desire for instant gratification. They can struggle with things like waiting patiently for their turn. Like, think of the "are we there yet?" kind of kids. And on this topic of impulsivity, Yosuke sticks his foot in his mouth all the time. He just blurts out anything and everything. I'm eyeing that "nice hands" line to the MC before he quickly shifts the topic. Though this also, of course, includes the hurtful and or homophobic things he says to Kanji. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying ADHD justifies or excuses saying cruel things. More, I'm just trying to explain why and or how someone with unchecked ADHD symptoms might actually wreck good relationships in their lives because of a lack of impulse control. And I will be diving into the implications of all of these things that Yosuke says in his dedicated analysis that should be out in the next month or two. On a related note, ADHD may be prone to frustration or angry outbursts, especially when emotions are particularly heightened. Neurodivergent people in general tend to feel emotions more strongly than the general population, and Yosuke has a number of these big emotional reactions throughout the narrative. A particular standout one to me is when he suggests they just chuck Namatame into the TV and be done with him. In this scene, he genuinely has to be convinced to step back for a second and really think things through. Now, another sign of ADHD is how Yosuke has a number of things going on at any given time. He wears a ton of different hats when it comes to Junez. Sometimes he's helping at the food court, other times it's at one of the stores, and then there's the additional preparation that goes into the seasonal events and sales. Yosuke also never has a shortage of ideas, for better or for worse. He likes novelty in general, and is usually the one who comes up with the fun group vacation plans. Which actually brings me to his biggest hang-up with Inaba back when he first moved there, and that's how boring he found it compared to the city. While I don't want to sit here waxing on and on about how rural places are a bad fit for someone with ADHD, because it can be a great one, it honestly just depends on if that particular person likes the outdoor recreation. Like, I've spent quite a bit of time myself living in these really rural areas over the years, back when I used to attend, then later worked at summer and outdoor rec camps, and there is quite a bit to do out here, especially if you're, again, interested in the outdoors. Though my general point here is that when comparing the sheer number of options slash variety here versus in the city, a rural town really can't come close. An urban center has tons of things open 24 hours a day, has way more things to try, and is generally a better fit for those seeking novelty. But with all this said, interestingly enough, what I personally find most relatable about Yosuke is that even though he has so many traits that could have resulted in this depiction as being widely disorganized, he's still presented as quite responsible, actually. Well, in a way that's more akin to how girls and/or women might mask symptoms. Like, we're usually raised to be more responsible for daily living or domestic tasks, so on the surface, it can appear like we're not as forgetful or chaotic in our day-to-day lives. I definitely ended up developing my own coping strategies growing up, and it's this tendency to find your own workarounds that seems to make diagnosing girls/women hard, and why so many of us end up not getting diagnosed until much later in life. And by the way, if you're one of those people who was diagnosed late in adulthood and don't mind sharing, I'd really love to hear if you can relate to this experience. Like, did you feel you had to find/develop your own coping strategies for what you now know are symptoms of ADHD? Though on the topic of women being diagnosed with ADHD, I really want to talk about Maya from Persona 2. And if you don't want spoilers for this duology, because I know that in the Persona fandom, the first 3 games are not really played as much, I'll give you a moment to skip ahead to the timestamp on screen. So I know I just got done talking about Yosuke presenting as more organized, like his room in the P4 Arena games is actually pretty tidy. Meanwhile, Maya is the exact opposite. Her room is an absolute chaotic mess, disorganization being a common symptom of inattentive ADHD. Another pretty interesting correlation in the ADHD neuroscience research is this delayed internal clock. Now, I'm nowhere near any kind of expertise in this field, but this seems to refer to something called the delayed sleep phase, where the brain doesn't start releasing melatonin until much later at night. So even if these people try to go to bed early, they just lie there awake for hours. Other recent studies show that 60% of adults with ADHD report having some kind of sleep disorder, with 31% report having trouble sleeping. And the reason I bring this up is that Maya finds mornings difficult, also because of low blood pressure apparently, and us neurospicy people do tend to have comorbidities with other health issues. So Maya naturally became a night person. But okay, the rest of the traits I'll be talking about lean more towards hyperactive ADHD. For one, she's quite impulsive, like she just assumes control of the freaking blimp, or immediately jumps to steering the boat towards the final Shibalba dungeon. In other words, there's this tendency to dive headfirst without always thinking things through. Maya's rationale is likely ADHD-prone jumps in pattern thinking, for better or for worse. I have a driver's license, and I'm good at that, so therefore it can't be too different from piloting this blimp or steering this boat, right? And, well, it's a miracle the Persona 2 cast survives her attempts here. She has this restless and gotta go fast energy too, particularly noticeable at the very end of Innocent Sin during the final scene in front of the subway station. Everyone else is just walking or looking around normally. Then there's Maya just booking it before crashing into Tatsuya. Her personality as a whole is the super genki, lively type. ADHD is often described as being driven by a motor, and she's always on the move and moving forward. You see, because our brains are always zipping from one idea to the next, it's pretty easy to always have a new angle of approaching something or a new possible solution to try. So overall, what I'm getting at is this mentality of there's always something else we haven't tried yet or tested out yet. And this can actually make ADHD very adaptable and great problem solvers. In fact, interestingly enough, a growing body of study finds that those with ADHD often perform well in fast-paced, high-intensity situations, making them suitable for crisis roles like first responders. Articles like these say such emergency personnel are praised for their ability to react quickly, adapt to rapidly changing situations, and manage multiple tasks simultaneously. The urgency and adrenaline activates dopamine, the neurotransmitter usually underactive in the ADHD brain. And also when you factor in the ability of hyperfocus, that intense, deep concentration for hours at a time for things that do passionately capture ADHD interest, it's this overall kind of response that's so helpful in emergency situations. Now, similarly, Maya is incredibly adaptable and a great matchup against the batshit insane events going on in the Persona 2 duology. You see, one of the biggest differences between the pre- and post-Hashino Persona games is the pace of the overall narrative. Persona 3 onwards takes place over the course of an entire year, with weeks of downtime and mundane life in between major events. Meanwhile, things get dire within the first few hours of Persona 1 and 2, with the pace never letting up from that point on. I found this one pretty convincing thread on the Persona subreddit that explains how the events of the Persona 2 games likely take place over the span of only a few weeks, and no more than a couple months at most. So talk about crisis mode the game. But with that said, depending on the circumstances, this adaptable mindset can also be a double-edged sword. Maya quickly dusts herself off time and time again and continues onwards despite obstacles. You know, her whole think positive shtick. She ends up being the heart and de facto leader of the group, always rallying everyone's spirits, even when things look like they're going to hell. But an overtly optimistic approach to adversity can become an eventual distraction from having to deal with the actual trauma arising from certain events. ADHDers tend to focus on the present moment as well, which can lead to a delay in processing and/or repression of grief. We can appear so collected in these crisis moments by not appearing bogged down by sadness or anxiety. Those feelings get brushed aside during emergencies, and even later when daily normal life inevitably returns again, because ADHD people like to distract ourselves with other things, other opportunities, other solutions. Plus, the added idea that mundane life isn't novel or interesting enough for hyperactive ADHD, and what results is these difficult feelings that were once tucked away remain like that for way too long. Out of sight, out of mind. Until they're not, and it all comes tumbling down at once. The way I see this play out in Maya's case is how, as innocent sin unfolds, more is revealed about the entire incident with the masked circle, and just how severe her reaction is over fire of any kind. She just completely forgot about that traumatic event until obvious verbal and physical reminders show up. By the way, I want to make it very clear that I'm not trying to downplay any given reaction to trauma, especially because this is a very serious topic. But okay, now moving on to Persona 4 and Naoto. I'm honestly surprised there isn't more conversation around her autistic coding given how often she's in fandom discourse. See, I find her neurodivergent coding quite important and refreshing because autism has historically been so underdiagnosed in girls. In fact, it used to be believed that only boys could be affected by autism or ADHD. One of her tendencies that really stands out is her very narrow and specific interest in only detective fiction and works. Let's say that again. It's only detective books. Like, she doesn't even talk about other genres of literature, just these detective mysteries. This brings me to a concept called monotropism. That's a core trait of autism. It's a tendency to focus one's attention tightly on a small or singular number of interests at any given time. So while this can aid in achieving a flow state that benefits the autistic person's performance, so in Naoto's case, it's her skill in solving difficult cases via her super sharp memory, for one. A prominent example of this shown right after the Namatame hospital incident, where she easily laid out the entire chronological history of the Inaba case off the top of her head, as a recap for the whole group. However, a trait like monotropism can also be debilitating in many ways, which leads me to a related trait, her cognitive rigidity, or rather, black and white way of thinking. You see, there's this concept called perseverative cognition, which refers to continuous thinking and rumination on a certain topic. And this kind of inflexible cognition is more common in autistic people than the general population. Apparently, what this ends up looking like in practice is getting stuck on a particular idea. So in the case of Naoto's journey with gender identity, we learn that because she only sees men depicted as detectives, she therefore must become a man in order to be respected in this field. Instead of recognizing this problem is more due to societal gender roles and how the wider culture assumes what men or women should do or be good at. And no, while Naoto herself doesn't arrive at a trans identity, I am by no means discounting any other journey with gender. And I will shill/recommend my dedicated Naoto analysis, by the way. But since we're on the topic of societal expectations, this brings me to her difficulty socializing with the other kids in general. Naoto says I was inept at making friends. The way she recounts all of this makes it sound like it wasn't necessarily a disinterest in forming relationships with these other kids, i.e. something maybe more along the lines of Akihiko, but rather that she was just bad at socializing in a quote-unquote normal neurotypical way. Now, this is definitely not an uncommon experience shared by those on the spectrum. Furthermore, Naoto is not the type of girl to tangibly emote much. It stands out to me that throughout the game, she doesn't cry when sad or frustrated like Chie, Ryukiko, and Rize do. An example of this within Persona 4's narrative is when Nanako flatlines. Outward displays of emotion are particularly expected out of women, so it's very likely Naoto was thought of as cold, uncaring, and just strange for not having the proper reactions, so to speak, as the other kids growing up. This aspect of neurodivergence is actually explored further in Persona 5 Strikers. Those of you who've played it probably know who I'm talking about. Autism is, to this day, still underdiagnosed in Japan as a whole. But it was even worse back in the early 2000s, the setting of Persona 4. And it's not uncommon for neurodivergent folks who are diagnosed later in adulthood to recall how much they blamed themselves for not fitting in, as in because they didn't know it was due to a difference in their cognition and brain. not a reflection of themselves as a person. But on the topic of women and underdiagnosed autism, this finally brings me to Persona 5 and Futaba. Her depiction adds some nice detail and differing aspects to what we've already covered in Akihiko's and Naoto's sections. Now, something I went over in much more detail in my dedicated Futaba analysis, which can be found in the cards or description, is how Japanese is considered a high-context language and culture compared to English, especially American English. High-context languages mean interactions usually take on an ambiguous tone. Implicit messages and avoidance of direct expressions are normal and common. Now, if we recall literal thinking from Akihiko's section, this indirect method of communication can pose a challenge to many on the spectrum. Additionally, native Japanese speakers tend to remove the subject or object of a sentence if they've already mentioned it earlier in the conversation, meaning a person must pay close attention to the entire social interaction. So remember monotropism? Many autistic people have trouble conversing unless it's about their topic of interest. What ends up happening is they are often perceived as rude when they don't answer or ignore others during conversation about other things. This inability to engage in the social niceties and pleasantries, the small talk, is even more glaring in such a socially conscious plus collectivist culture as Japan's. As you can probably guess, this poses a challenge to Futaba. There are various times throughout the game where she loses interest in a conversation or is distracted by something else that catches her interest. In fact, all of Futaba's early interactions with Makoto highlight how this kind of thing plays out. So it's these kinds of behaviors that can often lead neurotypical people to believe those with autism are selfish, but this belief is completely misguided. Yes, being on the spectrum can cause challenges in socialization and communication, but that does not mean autistic people can't and don't love other people, especially the most important people in their lives. It only means that they show these things in a different way from the general populace. In Futaba's case, she clearly loved her mom. Wakaba is her very reason for joining the Phantom Thieves, as well as her main driving force to claw her way out of the hikikomori hole and back into society. It's all out of respect for her mom's memory and to figure out what really happened to her research. While it might not have outwardly looked like it at times, Futaba was deeply aware it wasn't always easy for her mom to raise a daughter with struggles like hers, especially during her meltdowns, which, by the way, were likely due to a disruption in their normal routine a la the times Wakaba had to focus on her research. Speaking of, that brings us to another relevant part of the autistic spectrum that hasn't been depicted yet, and that's Futaba's sensory difficulties. You see, rank 5 of her confidant reveals a number of sensory issues people bullied her over in elementary school, and in my view, her reaction to her friend Kana yelling at her after she learned about some really personal family skeleton seemed like a meltdown triggered by both sensory, i.e. the noise, and emotional overload. She just completely shut down and eventually just ran to escape the overwhelming situation, not because she didn't care, but because the surrounding circumstances were too triggering at that moment. Futaba is still bothered by her reaction, this misunderstanding, years later, and goes out of her way to find Kana and ultimately make up for it. Now, one other thing that's fairly common in Persona games, well, just JRPGs if not anime in general, that I'd feel remiss not to comment on here is the tendency to portray autistic-coded characters as savants. Savant abilities refer to exceptional skills and talents, ones that significantly surpass those of the average population in any given area of expertise. In reality, this is quite misleading and unrealistic though, since it's approximately only 10% of those on the autism spectrum that exhibit such savant abilities. Like, sure, it makes sense to exaggerate in these fictional stories, as in Persona's case, we see characters like Akihiko and boxing, or Naoto and her skill as a detective. And then Futaba takes it a step further and not only demonstrates this savant syndrome with her genius tech abilities in Persona 5's main narrative, but her confidant also mentions her incredible memory and skill at test taking. So she's portrayed as a genius in multiple areas, though sadly in her case, because education on autism is so lacking in Japan, the teacher and other students just accused her of cheating, just adding to her reputation as this weird freak. But that's the beautiful thing about the Persona games and their respective cast of characters' exploration of found family, of discovering other people out there who do accept you for who you are on the inside. These were just my observations and takes on this topic though, so I'd love to hear your takes for perhaps other characters in the series you see as somewhere on the neurospicy spectrum. And maybe I'll do a follow-up video sometime responding to your comments. Like, for example, I can see the argument for the other bro characters like Junpei or Ryuji also being some type of ADHD. But thank you especially to all my patrons and channel members for making this video possible. Come join us in the private Discord where we do fun things like reading club and watch parties. And finally, I'd especially like to thank my Special Fusion supporters: Big Clingy, Sam Bezjak, M. Meownalin, Malcolm Lowry, Jimmy Tapiz, Frank Sasaki, Phoenix Black, Weeping Blade, Meek Massacre, Tactical Salmons, Silverwind 847, and Anger Boda.